Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a concept that, well, really seems to divide opinion. Liberalism. For some people, it's the absolute bedrock of modern progress. For others, maybe more like a wishy-washy compromise. We've got a great stack of sources here, including some really insightful bits from Gopnik's book, Thousand Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. We're going to use these to really dig into what liberalism is and maybe why it gets such strong reactions from, well, pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, it's a really important deep dive because, the word liberalism itself gets thrown around so much. It's often distorted, used as the sort of catch-all term, sometimes even as an insult by both the far right and the far left. So our mission today really is to cut through some of that noise, define what liberalism actually is, trace its history a bit, and try to understand why it sparks these intense debates.
That's a great goal. Because, what does it even mean? Here in America, if you say liberal, people often think vaguely like some Democratic Party stuff, right? But then, like you said elsewhere, in France, it might mean something closer to libertarianism. And the traditions that actually fed into our liberalism sometimes are called republicanism. So words definitely shift.
Absolutely. And that's where the confusion, or you could even say the weaponization of the term, really kicks in. The sources point out how it gets twisted. So for the right, liberals often get lumped in with left-wing radicals. It creates this sort of imaginary monster, the left liberal. And then for the actual left, liberals often become the dreaded neoliberal. And what's really striking when you look at the bigger picture is that both extremes often seem to dislike liberals more than they dislike each other. They share this kind of absolutist common ground.
Okay, so if you're one of those critics, what's the picture you're painting? They see liberals as, what? Cravens, spineless compromisers, people who are just defending a status quo that can't or shouldn't be defended. They get painted as out-of-touch elites, maybe moralizing, maybe hedonistic. The source mentions them being more likely to be writing a blog post about biodegradable bottles or trying to start a tasting of artisanal bourbons than actually, throwing the bourbon bottle at the bad guys.
Right. And given that kind of negative image, it really makes you ask, well, how has liberalism, in its actual form, shaped the world? And we'll see the sources argue that, far from being weak, liberalism is maybe the most truly radical ideology out there, responsible for, and this is a quote, everything eventually. The idea is that it proposes these really fundamental changes, it makes them happen, and crucially, it makes them stick.
That's a pretty big claim, the most radical of all ideologies. That definitely pushes against the common perception. How do the sources back that up? Is this where that metaphor comes in, the rhinoceros and the unicorn?
Exactly, yeah. The unicorn, it's perfect, it's idealized, but it's not real. The rhino, though, it's kind of ungainly, definitely imperfect, but it is real, and it's formidable. Liberalism, the argument goes, is like the rhinoceros. The core definition they give is something like an evolving political practice, one that argues for the necessity and the possibility of social reform, imperfectly egalitarian reform, and ever greater tolerance. Maybe not absolute tolerance, but greater tolerance. And how does it achieve this? Through reasoned and mostly unimpeded conversation, demonstration, and debate. It's built on what they call a cracked foundation of fallibilism, which is basically the truth that, well, we are usually wrong about everything and always divided within ourselves about anything we believe.
Okay, now this was really interesting to me. The idea that the first liberal wasn't some political theorist, but actually Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French essayist. He wasn't a philosopher or pundit like we think of them now. He invented the essay, which just means to try in French. And he apparently had this deep understanding of how divided we are, how our ideals often just don't line up.
Yeah, he was radical for his time because he based social behavior on things like compassion, skepticism, and uncertainty. Instead of dogma, justice, utopianism, he had this deep hatred of cruelty. That's key. So he's seen as this kind of emotional, not contractual, liberal, laying that cracked foundation for liberal morality.
And that connects really well to another idea in the sources from André Glucksmann, the raw, cooked, and rotting. Glucksmann basically said, look, most things are kind of rotting and rotten. Our main job is just to stop things from spoiling even more. We don't necessarily know what's perfect, but we definitely know what's bad. Cruelty is bad. Starvation is bad. State murder is bad. So it flips this pessimism about knowing ultimate truth into a kind of optimism about acting to prevent harm.
And if you broaden that out to the Enlightenment, it wasn't all just about, capital R reason taking over from God. Thinkers who were really influential for liberalism, like Adam Smith, David Hume, they put a huge emphasis on compassion and sympathy. Smith's famous idea that sympathy makes markets work, that actually built on Hume's more abstract work. And Hume's own death, facing it calmly as an infidel, was seen as a sort of test case for this humanistic approach.
So what really comes out of this is a focus on incremental reform, step-by-step change, not grand, revolutionary upheaval. The sources make a strong point that many goals from, say, 19th century socialist manifestos, public education, free healthcare, votes for women, things like that, they were actually achieved peacefully through reform in liberal countries, not through the kind of catastrophic revolutions you saw in, say, the Soviet Union.
And the period where modern liberalism really crystallized, it's actually a stunningly short time frame, according to the sources, roughly 1859 to 1872. That's when you get Darwin's On the Origin of Species, Mill's On Liberty, plus these huge political shifts happening in Britain, America, and France all around the same time.
Okay, so how did these big ideas actually play out in people's lives? There's that fantastic story about John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. They were deeply in love, apparently met secretly by the rhino's cage at the London Zoo, called it their old friend Rhino. And Mill always insisted she was his most important intellectual influence, his teacher.
It is fascinating, yeah, because later commentators, the sources say, really tried to downplay her role. They aggressively yoko-ed her, is the phrase used. But newer scholarship seems to confirm, no, her mind was as fine as her husband always asserted. Their work together, especially on the subjection of women, was incredibly radical for the time. They weren't just arguing for women's happiness or something. They were asking fundamentally what reason we have for thinking that any restraint on women's freedom is just, unquote. That work was huge in moving women from being seen as property, as chattel, towards being citizens.
And what's really compelling about their story is how their own lives seem to reflect this liberal idea. They quote, "Compromise is not a sign of the collapse of one's moral conscience. It is a sign of its strength." The way they navigated their own complicated situation, it sort of suggested that social compromise could also be, well, almost romantic, transformative.
So the natural question then is, okay, how did these ideals translate into actual concrete practice? We see another example with George Henry Lewes and Marian Evans, who we know better as the novelist George Eliot. They lived together as a married couple, but without any religious ceremony. They really embraced what the sources call a Darwinian liberalism, one focused on process, on how change happens in complex systems.
And maybe the most concrete, tangible example of this processed liberalism is actually the London sewers. Seriously. After the Great Stink in 1858, which sounds awful, it wasn't some magic bullet solution. It took decades of reasoned reform, incredible engineering, massive effort, all happening underground. There's a great line, "People made pipes and pipes made better people. The sewer was the sanity."
And Lettuce, interestingly, also came up with this idea of emergence. The idea that the rules governing a whole system can be totally different from the rules governing its individual parts. Think about it. Hydrogen and oxygen make water, right? But water is nothing like either of those gases. He saw this applying to social systems too, like a city's ballet of the street, as Jane Jacobs later called it, that emerges from millions of individual choices and interactions. And this idea directly challenges authoritarian thinking, which always wants to reduce everything to its basic parts and control it from the top.
Okay, so these ideas, process, emergence, small steps, how do they actually show up in our world today? Let's look at some more contemporary stuff. Robert Putnam's work on social capital, that seems really relevant here. He showed how these intermediate institutions, like the local choir or a bowling league or whatever, how they build trust and cooperation, and how that makes local democracy actually work better.
Yeah, and that links nicely to Jürgen Habermas's idea about the primacy of the public sphere. He talked about how the coffee houses and salons back in the 17th, 18th centuries, they created this sort of caffeinated pathway out of clan society into cosmopolitan society. He even said, famously, that a parliament is only as strong as the coffee house beside it.
It's amazing how that echoes things from much earlier, like Frederick Law Olmsted, the guy who designed Central Park. He was observing this commonplace civilization in the North before the Civil War, this orgy of sociability, he called it, in all sorts of clubs and societies. It's basically Putnam's idea, but like 150 years earlier.
And all these concepts, social capital, public sphere, community, they aren't just abstract, they have really concrete effects. Consider what the sources call the most startling and least talked about of all public developments in America in the past half-century, the Great Crime Decline.
That's right. Violent crime just plummeted starting in the early 90s. It totally reshaped cities, especially for the most vulnerable people. And the sources are pretty clear. It wasn't just mass incarceration or stop-and-frisk policies that caused it.
So, what was the main driver then? Well, sociologists largely point to community policing, married to community action. Basically, local community groups acting like those Habermasian coffee houses, working with police, transforming their neighborhoods. Process liberalism worked, as the sources put it. Small, incremental changes building on each other, creating these virtuous circles of sympathy.
Okay, so we've built this picture of liberalism as pragmatic, incremental, focused on process. Now let's switch gears and look at the critiques. Starting with the right. The right-wing critique of liberalism, the sources say, is primarily an attack on its perceived undue faith in reason.
And it's important to take conservative philosophy seriously here, not just dismiss it with caricatures. It often really emphasizes the value of the natural order of family and community, and it sometimes laments what it sees as a pyrrhic triumph of liberalism, maybe winning individual freedom but losing community bonds, maybe abandoning people who aren't seen as productive.
And the dividing line isn't always just about small government versus big government, is it? Often what really separates liberals from mainstream conservatives are things like certain ideas about respect and certain rituals of reverence. Especially, the sources note, respect for the military and reverence for religion.
You can see this kind of dynamic historically. Think about Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative prime minister in 19th century Britain, versus William Gladstone, the liberal. Disraeli, who was this flamboyant figure, Jewish, a dandy he understood that appeals to national pride, to empire, could be incomparably more powerful than economic self-interest. And interestingly, he was the one who actually oversaw the building of the London sewers, a very liberal project in practice. It shows that regal means and rational measures, grand gestures and practical steps can come from the conservative side too.
And this idea, this politics of national grandeur, you see it later in figures like Charles de Gaulle in France. He came from a very traditionalist background, but became this absolute pillar of the Republic. He showed how important national dignity, shared symbols are for holding any modern state together.
Okay, but what happens when this desire for order, for grandeur, for certainty goes too far? The sources identify sort of three main flavors of authoritarianism that stand against liberalism. First, there's triumphalist authoritarianism. This is all about strength versus weakness. Liberals are seen as weak, soft, too concerned with enemies. This type believes the nation or the tribe must dominate others. It's fundamentally hostile to the rule of law. It's just about whoever wins rules. And the sources argue this is pretty much the default condition of government for almost all of human history. Even something like Hitler's Mein Kampf, they describe it less as a coherent plan and more as just a survey of grievances, all rooted in personal resentment and humiliation. Second type, theological authoritarianism. This rests on divine authority. From this perspective, liberals are arrogant. They deny God's truth. Or maybe they just borrow religious values frivolously on loan without acknowledging the source. Thinkers like G.K. Chesterton, who argued that reason is always a kind of brute force and that without God, society just collapses into chaos. And the third type is tragic authoritarianism. This isn't so much about God or raw strength. It's more about a deep pessimism, the inherent sadness of life, the futility of human desires. Liberal ideas of progress are seen as hubris, ignoring our shared mortality, the fundamental tragedies of the human condition. Samuel Johnson is mentioned here. For him, even good government ended in death. And this tragic view, especially when it links up with anti-rationalism, can be really potent. You see it in thinkers who influence regimes like Putin's, emphasizing the primacy of differences, ethnic, linguistic, over any kind of liberal universalism. The novelist Michel Houellebecq is brought up too for his satires of liberal decadence and his exploration of Islamic militancy as a potential alternative in his novel Submission.
Okay, those are some heavy critiques. So how does liberalism, or how can liberals respond? Well, first, the sources argue that the idea of liberalism as only being about individual rights and selfish materialism is just a cartoon.
Yeah, what's compelling is when you actually look at classic liberal texts and historical liberal practice, you find this powerful idea of collectivity and community at their heart. Adam Smith, we mentioned him earlier, he thought community sympathy was absolutely a necessary prelude to free market exchanges. It wasn't just about self-interest.
And historically, those big liberal revolutions in the 19th century, they were often unifying revolutions, bringing together different ethnic groups, different religious groups under one national banner. The sources mention Robert Baldwin and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine in Canada, a Protestant and a Catholic joining forces against an anti-Catholic mob, all in the name of national unity and liberal rights.
And what about the charge of weakness? The sources push back hard on that. Historically, they argue, the weaknesses of liberalism have always been imaginary. Open, pluralistic societies have, time and again, proven more resilient and ultimately stronger than closed, authoritarian ones. Think the American Civil War, the World Wars, the Cold War, even the War on Terror is presented as an example. The liberal city adapted, renewed itself, while the jihadist threat seems, well, weaker now as a compelling moral force.
And responding to the theological critique, the liberal argument is pretty straightforward. There are just too many gods.
Right.
Tolerance, the sources argue, wasn't some top-down liberal invention. It actually started as a practical pact between competing churches after centuries of horrible religious wars. It was driven by sheer horror at religious violence.
Which means, ironically perhaps, that faith has never flourished so freely and variously as it has in the liberal city. And it's kind of striking, the sources point out, that the issues on which Christians particularly tend to rest their case for intolerance and persecution turn out to be, in any sane historical perspective, absurdly tiny. Like the example given. The possibility, for instance, that a fundamentalist baker might be forced to bake a gay cake. The suggestion is that the real complaint often is just being forced to live alongside moral communities, not their own.
Okay, so that covers the right's critique and the liberal responses. Now, let's flip to the other side, the left. If the right sees too much faith in reason, the left often sees liberalism as intrinsically and incurably exploitative and inequitable. The argument is that free societies inevitably just mean free market societies, which leads straight to predatory capitalism.
And why this really harsh critique? Well, the sources explain that the left points to very real historical examples of exploitation. Things like King Leopold II's horrific brutality in the Belgian Congo, carried out under a supposedly liberal Belgian state, or the U.S. supporting military dictatorships in Latin America while championing democracy elsewhere. And even within liberal countries, you see these vast inequalities. The source uses the image of the oligarch's erection, these huge luxury condo towers in New York while many struggle. It reminds me of that Chris Rock line, if ordinary people really knew how the rich lived, they'd riot.
And there's a clear historical moment, right? Around 1864, Marx attending the Working Men's Association meeting. The sources mark that as a decisive and permanent fault line, where the liberal and the radical left traditions really started to diverge sharply.
Yeah, and a figure who really embodies that tension and its complexities is Emma Goldman. She was a dedicated anarchist, a radical. But her memoirs also show this incredible humanity, this love of life. She was deported from the U.S., and notably, there wasn't much protest from liberals at the time. But then, crucially, after initially supporting the Bolshevik Revolution, she had the courage to denounce it as a nightmare. She came to see that liberty without socialism is injustice, socialism without liberty is slavery and brutality, a powerful realization.
The sources also track a shift in radical complaints, right? From being purely about economics to becoming increasingly about culture as well. This is where that term neoliberalism comes in, used almost as a swear word on the left. It's basically a shorthand for the spread of free market ideas, deregulation, privatization, things the left sees as driving inequality and undermining social solidarity.
And that leads into the concept of intersectionality. The sources describe it as this impressively ambitious effort to offer a unified field theory of cultural and economic oppression. The core idea is that different forms of oppression based on race, gender, sexuality, class, college, they don't just add up, they intersect. They interact to create unique experiences, unique nodes of oppression. So it encourages people to assert their specific identities, their differences, rather than aiming for a kind of colorblind universalism that might erase those experiences. The Anita Hill hearings are mentioned as a key moment in the development of this kind of thinking.
Okay, so faced with these powerful critiques from the left, what's the liberal response? The sources admit it's often rhetorically weak. It's just hard to sound passionate and exciting when you're being circumspectly liberal against fiercely radical arguments. But they argue, historically, it has also been demonstrably correct.
There's this idea of a tragic rule of 21st century life, a rule of double amnesia. The right often acts as if the 19th century, with all its inequalities and injustices that spurred reform, never happened, while the left sometimes acts as if the 20th century, with the catastrophic failures of actual communist revolutions, never took place. The sources talk about ghost Marxism using the old revolutionary language without grappling with the history of what happened when those revolutions were actually tried.
So what does that mean practically? Well, take environmental issues. Some on the left blame environmental disasters squarely on capitalism. But the sources push back a bit. They argue that growth itself, not just the economic system, is a major driver. And historically, communist command economies often had far worse environmental records than capitalist ones.
And this connects to a broader liberal critique of what you might call determinism or essentialism.
Yeah.
The idea that our language or our social categories completely blind us from seeing power structures, or the demand to know the true nature or essence of something like what is a woman, what is black,
Yeah.
etc. The sources argue that trying to validate an idea by tracing it back to its origin is actually a quintessentially reactionary notion. They even compare it to the Nazis talking about Jewish physics.
Yeah, the point seems to be that essentializing anything in order to contain or dismiss it is always a false friend to reform. It shuts down complexity, ambiguity, plurality. The better question, they suggest, is always, what relation does what's being said have to what actually happens? Or, more simply, is that true?
And related to that, the concept of privilege. The sources offer a different perspective. Maybe, they suggest, privilege is a less interesting name for a more interesting thing, and that is good fortune. And if that's the case, then the goal of social reform isn't necessarily about tearing down privilege, but rather to draw more and more people into the privileged category, meaning ensuring fundamental rights, opportunities, basic security, good fortune for everyone, not seeing it as some zero-sum game where it's an unearned right appropriated by a few.
Okay, and finally, under the response to the left, there's the huge issue of free speech. For liberals, tracing back to John Stuart Mill, the principle is pretty clear. Speech should only be restricted at the absolute extreme when it causes real harm, not just offense or discomfort. The freedom to criticize, even ideas we hate, is seen as absolutely essential for discovering truth, for making progress.
But the left often sees free speech differently, viewing it more through the lens of power. Who gets to speak? Whose voices are heard? How does speech impact marginalized groups? Does it inflict real pain? The sources mention Canadian Justice Rosalie Abella, who argues for limiting expression sometimes, specifically hate speech, precisely because it harms marginalized groups. So you see this real tension between classic civil liberties, freedom from interference, and human rights, which might require positive action to protect certain groups.
And this really loops back to something fundamental about liberalism itself. The sources are quite blunt. Quote, a great deal of the radical reproach to liberalism is true. Much of the critique lands. And often the best, most honest liberal response is simply, you're right, let's do better. It's like King Lear on the Heath, suddenly realizing the suffering he ignored. Liberalism is fallibilism. It's about acknowledging error and trying to fix it.
And that leads to another strong claim. No system of power in human history has tried so hard to inject a corrective conscience into its institutions as liberalism has. The very fact that the left's sharpest critiques are often developed and debated within that quintessential liberal institution, the research university, that's seen as a shining specificity, not a contradiction.
Yeah, there's this really interesting point about mutual learning. Radicals, the sources suggest, need to learn the value, the necessity of liberal institutions. They discover, like Emma Goldman did, that these spaces are actually rare and fragile when they disappear. But liberals also absolutely need to listen to and learn from radical cries for justice. Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln are presented as embodying this dynamic. Douglass, the fiery abolitionist, the prophetic absolutist, constantly pushing. Lincoln, the political constitutionalist, working within the system, evolving.
Their intertwined stories show how powerful both roles are, how they need each other.
So, where does all this leave us? What does it mean today? The sources use the example of Wellfleet on Cape Cod, described as a liberal hotbed. It's a place where you see all the quirks, the contradictions, the humanity of liberalism, but you also see its ongoing struggles. Economic inequality, racial segregation, climate change impact in the coast, even, apparently, sharks in the water. And each problem generates different explanations. Right-wing ones blaming liberal policies, left-wing ones blaming consumption or climate change itself.
Which brings us back to that fundamental question. How do you get from a statement like, science is real, to one like, love is love? The honest liberal answer, according to the sources, is we can't, not by any single or simple rule. There's no grand unified theory. Liberal reasoning is described as this ongoing, surprising, vigilant action. The argument is more pragmatic. Treating both facts and love as important, as true in their own ways, simply tends to make more people happy. It works.
And this leads to what the sources call a positive program for liberalism. What does that look like? It starts with public-mindedness, just recognizing that some things government can do better than individuals or the market. It heavily emphasizes public education, especially early education, calling it a potential cholera cure for inequality. And it also demands passionate policies, recognizing that on issues like gun violence or medical bankruptcy, what seem like hard choices are actually just choices that have to be made. We can choose differently.
And underpinning all this is that idea of 1,000 small sanities, echoing the book title. The point is that huge problems rarely get solved by one single big idea. It's usually through these incremental measures, these practical steps accumulating over time, like the London sewers, like the crime decline. We don't need a perfect theory of ultimate fairness to make life significantly fairer right now.
So in the end, liberalism is like that rhinoceros again. Ungainly and ugly and short-legged and imperfect and squat. Not exactly inspiring, maybe. But the rhinoceros is real. It exists. And it is formidable. Its core values, skepticism about grand claims, pluralism aiming for constant small improvements, compassion, these are presented as real positive forces.
Which implies that the actual work of liberalism, this messy ongoing process of empathy and argument, of making specific choices and particular distinctions, telling real things from imagined ones and useful ones from useless ones, rhinos from unicorns, maybe that is the real work of being human.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to take away, something to maybe mull over. The forces suggest that populism, whether from the right or the left, isn't just some temporary phase driven by economics or social media. It might represent something deeper. A profound unease with the inconsistencies and uncertainties of an open society. A kind of permanent human temptation towards a closed and settled system. If that's true, then the fight to maintain an open society, resisting what the sources call the totalitarian tendencies of the left and the authoritarian brutalities of the right, well, that fight will never end. So the question for you is, what personal small sanity, what small concrete action can you contribute to that ongoing effort in your own life, in your own community?